some real history from simple history. Life under the most evil communist regime, Khmer Rouge. Now, I haven't watched this. This is going to be my first interaction with this material. And I'm going to let it run for a little bit, especially the intro without pausing because I have to pee. So you won't be able to pause it. But as soon as I come back, we'll be able to discuss our thoughts on this, especially because I feel like this will be a good rudder to steer this conversation to the Blowback podcast and its latest series. All right, let's start.
Life under the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, famine, and S-21, 1975 to 1979. When the Vietnamese army captured Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, from the Khmer Rouge in 1979, they found the city in a terrible state. And among the horrors they came across was a former high school that had been turned into a prison and was known as Security Prison 21, or just S-21. The dark buildings were enclosed in electrified barbed wire, and iron bars covered all the windows. The prisoners included academics, doctors, monks, students, and their teachers, as well as factory workers and engineers. All were accused of being enemies of the regime and tortured and forced to name their friends and family members as co-conspirators. Whole families were often brought in together to be interrogated and executed. Ultimately, paranoia meant that the regime began to turn on itself, and the cells were soon filled with party activists and their families, and even high-ranking politicians. At least 18,145 people had been imprisoned there, and all but a handful had been executed. S-21 was only one of more than 150 torture and execution centers established by the Khmer Rouge. Today, it stands as a memorial to the lives lost and to the brutality that they inflicted upon the people of Cambodia.
I don't know, man. I'm not
The Khmer
sure.
Rouge was the name given to the members of the Communist Party of Cambodia.
Okay, it seems like you guys had a lot of thoughts on the animation style.
Well, and now I'm looking at the food and the wine. They have champagne apparently too.
I hate to say it because Ben has done great work for us, Ben Clarkson, but I think we may have a candidate for next season's trailer, whoever made this. This is a little bit of a cut above, I would say, what we've done with that video.
I agree.
Okay,
I hate to say it.
so you're saying so far so good, no notes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, look, I mean, it's not saying we were kind of talking over it, but it doesn't seem to be saying anything radically inaccurate.
Yeah, it as Brendan pointed out, in fact, uses like a storytelling element that like we do, which is like, describing the scene, like the moment when like Vietnamese soldiers came into like the torture center of the Khmer Rouge, a place called S-21 or Tuol Sleng, in the capital city of Phnom Penh in Cambodia, after the Vietnamese kicked out the Khmer Rouge. And it's true, everything that they show in this video is all there. It just looks a little, it's
Is
a
this
little
what
off.
YouTube history? Is this what YouTube history is, or history YouTube? Like,
Is this what we're up against, Hasan? Is this like our competitor?
I don't know. I've actually never even encountered this channel. I don't think. It's just I kind of looked at it and I was like, what's a good like short and sweet video that we can use as like.
I mean, I'm impressed. I am it's like I said, the facts aren't bad.
A lot of people in the chat are saying yes, unironically yes, sadly yes.
that this is what YouTube history is like, because like sometimes I'll look for archival clips. YouTube, you'd be surprised how much you can find, of debates or Nixon or Kissinger tapes, and it's just easy to get from there. But I'll have to scroll by a lot of stuff, and it's the thumbnail of like of a white guy being like this, like looking shocked, and then he's got like a like a pastel background, and it says like, worst war crimes of all time, ? And it doesn't.
Me off.
I was about to say, if anyone knows the Rob Wiseman tweet, Uber driver suck me off. It kind of just has a very jarring thumbnailification of like quite heavy events. But I guess you could say the same thing about some episodes of our show. So I should probably just be humble.
Well, that's why we were saying that we should have this guy start doing our animation from now on.
In terms of like the content, I was peeing, so I didn't hear it, but did they mention American support for Khmer Rouge early on?
Oh, not yet. We're not. We're at the beginning of the story.
We have not gotten there in the video. I wonder if they would, but it's funny. There were people in Cambodia we spoke to. Noah and I went to Cambodia and Vietnam for the purposes of this season, and we had people who were really helpful and showing us around, and even some people there didn't know about America's support for the Khmer Rouge. It's not that it's top secret. It was published by the journalists really on top of these stories at the time, but it seems like a much more important fact than it was ever really given um, given credit for, and that's part of the reason we were attracted to this season, was to not only cover the American bombing of Cambodia and Nixon and Kissinger and the story that is somewhat familiar to people, certainly the Vietnam War is, but to stay after the Vietnam War is over and then see where things went from there. Not only the rise of the Khmer Rouge, but then their weaponization by the United States against our old enemy Vietnam. And I think that people would be quite surprised to learn that, say, when the Vietnamese kicked out Pol Pot, we condemned them kicking out Pol Pot and enforced a sanctions regime against the new government in Phnom Penh during famine conditions. Things that might sound familiar to people from the topic we were just discussing moments ago. So it's a fascinating history, and one that I think, as we try to do, one that we think should be more well known.
All right. Well, let's continue with this this work of art.
CPK, who ruled Cambodia between 1975 and 1979. They were led by the infamous Pol Pot, who attempted to purify Cambodian society along racial, social, and political lines. This led to one of the worst cases of genocide in history. Influenced by Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward in China, Pol Pot imagined his own super Great Leap Forward in Cambodia. After seizing power in a civil war in 1970,
You made a face there.
Well, I'm intrigued by the thought bubbles that Pol Pot is having. One was just a building, and which they did have.
Also, like, where is he? He looks like he's in a room in a Counter-Strike map.
And then they wanted. It seems like he's dreaming of missiles. I guess I don't.
Yeah,
that
like
really
a super
actually
great
wasn't-
leap forward with missiles. They're leaping forward with missiles.
Yeah,
Just like Mao.
I'm learning. Just like Mao, I'm learning is what I'm saying.
75, the CPK wanted to rapidly build the country under their own vision. Pol Pot compared the Cambodian revolution with those in China, Korea, and Vietnam, and proclaimed that no revolution would be as fast as his. Indeed, the CPK was obsessed with speed, and many in the party were paranoid that they would be replaced, and believed the faster their plans could be achieved, the safer they would be. The super great leap was to be achieved independent of any foreign aid, through independent self-mastery.
Guy sounds like
Khmer
Solid
Rouge
Snake.
theorists
What'd you say?
This guy sounds like Solid Snake to me.
Yeah, a little
Narrator.
bit. Well, I mean, put some respect on David Hayter's name, sir.
Well, I mean, we don't know that it's not him working on this documentary.
He would never do such a thing.
believe that
No,
an
I
initial
agree with you. I'm
period of
just hearing him. I'm
self-imposed
hearing this.
economic isolation would stimulate the rebirth of the crafts and the country's industrial capability. In order to follow this policy of extreme self-reliance, the CPK announced a 4-year plan to triple the country's rice production. However, Cambodia
hear
had
it, Noah?
suffered severely during the Civil War.
I'm
Almost
waiting. I'm
three-quarters
waiting
of-
for him to. I'm waiting for the narrator to say the Khmer Rouge wanted a weapon to rival Metal Gear. Or
Yeah,
something
no,
like
it's
That was
it's
pretty
really
good.
like quite intense. It's
you.
like like I don't know, like brother number snake or something.
Otacon.
Oh, revolution. Yeah, revolutionary consciousness, huh?
Pol Pot lined up everyone with glasses and killed them. Otacon, you have glasses.
of the draft animals needed to plow the fields had been killed, and by 1975, rice production had dropped by 84%. Such a rapid increase in production was impossible, but Pol Pot believed this was merely a matter of revolutionary willpower and
One thing I
instituted
would
his
say is that
policy
like
of
it is worth pointing out, like Pol Pot was the head of this government, but like it was like a clique. Like it was kind of famously like there was a gang that was at the top of the Khmer Rouge during this period. Again, Pol Pot was the guy in charge, but most famously there was a foreign minister Yang Sari, defense minister Sun Sen, and like they kind of collectively, and this is also I mean, like in Nazi Germany, like Hitler was the concentrated power of authority, but like he also had like a gang at the top that made it possible for like the Nazi, that we're like essentially the executive function in that regime. And I think it's, like here it was, again, like much poorer, much different place than 1930s Germany. But like what you do see is like this group that's like very paranoid, very secretive, that are carrying out this crazy radical, like silly radical like agricultural revolution. They're doing it, in this crazy like this psychotically backbiting, incompetent way. And so that's like the only thing that I feel like is missing in describing this is that like as one person we interviewed, the journalist Elizabeth Becker, who reported from Cambodia in these years, she said, not during the Khmer Rouge, but before and after, she said that like you have to remember that everything the Khmer Rouge did, just like imagine it's being done, but it's being done like really incompetently by like the most incompetent people in ways that you could not overrate or overstate.
Also, she was there during the Khmer Rouge years. She interviewed Pol Pot.
That's true. She did. She did visit. I just don't want to give the impression that she was like watching all this stuff happening and taking notes. But yes, she had a pretty famous and ill-omened visit.
Maybe
Okay,
Elizabeth is in this video.
What if the Nixon attitude towards Khmer Rouge early on was not about disrupting their Vietnamese neighbors' operations, but instead because Nixon was a secret Maoist?
This
Have
is
you guys,
what
have
many
you guys talked about
this
that?
is what this is what many of his right-wing critics thought. I mean, Nixon. It's interesting because Nixon came up as a part of the China lobby, kind of political club, which were the fanatics about getting rid of the Chinese revolution. But in partnering with Kissinger and making peace with communist China, as we discussed around the same time that we were actually signing on with Israel as a special relationship, Nixon was betraying, in a large sense, the Cold Warriors that he had come up with, and a lot of people thought he was, a communist somehow. So it has been floated, like John Birch Society types thought that.
Just saying, maybe that's something to investigate a little bit further. He is responsible for giving up the true China, which is
Taiwan.
Yeah, which is Taiwan. So, just saying.
Of agricultural offenses, including a nationwide system of forced labor. He believed that achieving his economic goals would be as simple as winning the Civil War. The army and the CPK's agricultural warfare were the people, and manual labor was the key to victory. The purpose of every Cambodian was to work and advance the revolution. Villages were reorganized into cooperatives, and thousands of city dwellers were forced out of their homes to work on the farms. As a result of this policy, workers of all ages were forced to do 10 to 14 hours of hard labor per day in unsustainable conditions. Often, survivors reported working late into the night, particularly during harvest time, surrounded by encouraging slogans urging them to pledge to sacrifice your life to accomplish Angar's work, or to stay on the work site until death. A lot of food was needed to feed all these productive farmers. However, rice was also needed for Pol Pot's economic goals, so large amounts of rice were extracted from the population for party use and export. The CPK provided nothing in return. Fareth, one survivor of the period, recalled that she was assigned to a children's work unit when she was 11 years old. Fareth was ordered to carry soil, dig trenches, and help build a local dam. She and her unit lived at the work site.
I'm getting the sense this video, like, there was just an interview there with a cartoon person. Like, that must be an interview based on reality, I assume, but they're not like sourcing anything. So I'm just worried this channel may not have the right approach towards sourcing, and it would undermine its academic viability.
Well, if you've already paid a guy on Fiverr, you might as well use him throughout the entire thing. It's an aesthetic choice that they're making, it seems.
It's true.
But, one that is probably beneficial for for their profit structure as well.
I didn't I didn't know David Hayter was on Fiverr, but they spent the
It's this,
money
yeah.
well.
So, um, so I do you. Let me ask you this question. I guess it's like a broader snapshot of this video that we're watching. Do you feel like covering this perspective exclusively on how this was communism and it was bad communism, evil, scary, gives full attention to actually the rise and fall of the Khmer Rouge?
I think that like one of the things that sort of it really just depends on how much weight somebody tries to put on the communist dimension of this. Like, is this a really communist or Marxist vision? Um, one source that we cite in the show actually talks about plans for agricultural reform that had been drawn up for Thailand, the country next door, that were not all that dissimilar. There were real problems that Cambodia faced with a lot of people living in the city, living in Phnom Penh in particular. And there was some like rebalancing in order. Obviously, the way that the Khmer Rouge went about it was stupid and insane and violent. Um, but I think that it's sort of like the Khmer Rouge didn't do all this because they had like a really I think like really like a rich communist tradition they felt participating in. I think that their vision was actually much more nationalist in nature and was much more focused on a revitalization and renewal of the ancient Khmer kingdom. And that was the sort of axis through which like a lot of like a project of national renovation was really how they kind of characterized a lot of this. They didn't even publicly announce themselves as Marxist until a couple of years into the existence of the regime, and it was only after Mao died, and there was a lot of pressure from China, presumably, to make that happen.
It was China. There was there was a communist movement before the Khmer Rouge that was largely dismantled after the 50s or in the middle of the 50s. They were the sort of second generation of Cambodian communists, and they harbored a lot of bitterness and resentment toward the Vietnamese, which had already existed in some kind of cultural and historical sense in Cambodia. But they really thought the Vietnamese were the final boss, and that everyone in the way, including the American imperialists, were going to do the easy part. And the fact that they did survive the Cambodian Civil War and the American bombing, in which the Viet Cong did the vast majority of the fighting, by the way, for them, only strengthened that idea. By the time they take power, they've been in a socialist movement, but it's been one informed by a kind of small, inward-looking movement that had much more to say about Cambodian nationalism, or believed far more deeply in Cambodian nationalism and therefore the xenophobia they had built up, than they did on any kind of doctrine or socialist project. And they were criticized pretty ruthlessly by their Vietnamese and Chinese friends. Eventually, the Vietnamese weren't their friends, and even when the Chinese were their patron, the Chinese stopped trying to argue with them about the extremism of their program, because they were useful enough to them. The Khmer Rouge were useful enough to Beijing as a geopolitical ally, but they really didn't think much of the Khmer Rouge program. So the communist world and the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, had nothing to do with the Khmer Rouge, and in fact tried to unseat them while the U.S. was making common cause with them. So as a communist movement, it was really quite a black sheep in the 20th century. And whether you even care about these labels of what kind of communists they were and blah blah blah, I mean, there's a lot of writing on that. Some suggest it was a more of a classic peasant revolution that had far less to do with modern ideas of socialism and communism. But they certainly at first identified as such. When they go into the jungles in the 80s, after the Vietnamese kicked them out and the Americans start supporting them, though, they were the first communist party to dissolve themselves. And Pol Pot said, we're going to have to follow the West now. And they got rid of their Mao jackets and they started wearing safari suits. And so they gave up the communist look pretty quickly, which of course makes some suspect that they
and they also, I don't think, were ever like, they didn't have like they didn't have like a like a lot of communist states have meaningful foreign relations. And in the case of the Khmer Rouge, they had one set of relations with China, which sent them a bunch of money, and that was who they cared about. And for a time, at the beginning, they had relations with Vietnam before that went south. And yeah, I mean, to me, like,
Seems like
to
you're
sort of
saying
just
they're MAGA
reiterate,
communists.
yeah,
That's what
I
someone
mean,
said in the majority report comment section the other day, which in a way, where they were they were make Cambodia great again, communists.
Yeah,
But
MACA.
yes, in a sense they were.
Yeah, or
Maca, yeah,
yeah, yeah,
Makaga.
I could use some MAGA.
Um,
Makaga.
but
Love
yeah,
MAGAs.
they gave up their communism pretty quickly as soon as it became advantageous to. So I guess that if people want to judge them on how they acted once they were out of power, it doesn't seem too sincere. They let the Yugoslavs in to film a documentary at one point, but otherwise Noah's right. Their only real relationship in the trading and economic sense was with China and the U.S. We funneled them money and arms and training through a coalition, which is always useful to do, kind of like the Mujahideen, and just claimed that if anything gets to the Khmer Rouge, we had no idea. Of course, most of it did. Peter Jennings did a great documentary piece for ABC in the early 90s, and we were still supporting them, and basically told the world that we were. It's really good. I think it's still on YouTube. I grabbed a copy elsewhere, but for the show, but it's a good report, and
One
unfortunately, it didn't stop us doing it.
one thing that you brought up was the way that the media was talking about the Khmer Rouge early on during the
Hmm.
period of our not so overt allegiance. And I think that is very instructive usually in figuring out like where the State Department's opinions lie. I believe you said that there was like positive coverage as well, not dissimilar to Osama bin Laden from Western media.
Uh, in the beginning, the most positive coverage of the Khmer Rouge were coming from left-wing sympathizers who thought that there was no way that these stories from refugees going into Thailand could possibly be true. There was a history,
Oh,
a
the
very
the
real
Noam
history they were
Chomsky, yeah,
pointing.
the Noam Chomsky paradigm as well. Isn't that like
He
something
he
that
he got he got in trouble for saying that we have to be suspect about the stories. I think it's been a little exaggerated to the degree that it's not as though he said they're all lies, but he was operating off of the, again, very real history that we also cover in the show of pure invention of communist atrocity when it came to Vietnam. So I think there were a lot of left wingers who were like, I'm not going to get fooled again, and in so
And like, I
doing
mean,
did not see it.
the Vietnamese themselves, like, bottled, like, they were, like, about 2 years into the reign of the Khmer Rouge, when things, I mean, really after the first year, when things started to go quite badly, um, the sort of, like, one way that they began resolving their problems without really resolving them was by attacking Vietnam, which China was happy for because they wanted Vietnam, they viewed Vietnam as their principal rival, and they were like, well, Cambodia is kind of a basket case, but if they're gonna, take the fight to Vietnam, then fuck it, good for them. And I think that, like, in Vietnam, we cite sources, people who ended up after a border conflict, where Cambodian forces, Khmer Rouge forces, massacre Vietnamese villages. And these are people from Soviet bloc countries, not necessarily that sympathetic to Cambodia in this stage, more sympathetic to Vietnam, and they are just learning. After like 2 years into this, they're like, oh, only now am I like did I start to consider that like the Cambodian Holocaust stories were real. That's what this Hungarian journalist called him. But I think that that's sort of a good illustration of also how like the earliest coverage of these people really emphasized like the mystery and secretiveness of this, because again, like, that's part of what happens when you don't have foreign relations, is that like the only people who end up supporting
Hmm.
your doofy radical program are academics who don't know better, and don't have firsthand knowledge, and I guess China in this case.
Uh, the more striking stuff is the coverage of them, the positive coverage of them long after these were reported. And we cite one New York Times op-ed that whose title was Pol Pot, brutal yes, but no mass murderer. And the pull quote in that is Vietnam is the real threat to Cambodia. This was because, and actually, that journalist was a very involved journalist in covering the brutal wars America was waging in Indochina. And he had just preserved a certain, I suppose you would say, misguided, misguided allegiance to the Khmer Rouge to the point where he opposed the Vietnamese into the 90s for, I guess, being mean to them and overthrowing Pol Pot. At any rate, it was in the New York Times. It was good enough for them. And of course, there were sort of feigned protests by American diplomats, but we preserved their seat at the UN and allowed for good coverage of them and positive coverage of them. So that's perhaps more shocking to people. And of course, the actual U.S. policy itself is shocking. But they when Elizabeth Becker, one of the key guests in our show, she was with one of these Western academics. He's all Scottish, I think, or
Yeah,
Australian.
he
I
was a
can't
Scottish.
remember.
He was a Scottish academic who worked at SOAS in London. Malcolm
And
McDowell.
he got murdered a room over from her while they were visiting, and they were interviewing Pol Pot, and she almost got attacked herself, but she escaped. And he was killed. She suspects that the Cambodians did it to kind of say never come back, even though they were the ones who had invited her and the deceased guy. Um, so yeah, it was an odd ideological trajectory from all sides as the sort of the super third worldists and the American architects of foreign policy came together in saying these guys aren't so bad because the Vietnamese are the real imperialists at this point.
And
Very,
that
very
was
bizarre.
like the like narrative of like Vietnam as like committing like wanton massacres. I mean, there were the issues over like boat people, Chinese ethnic minorities in Vietnam and their treatment. Like Vietnam was catching a lot of black eyes in the sort of global PR of the time, but like they were absorbing all that while they were like, and they were people were criticizing them for being the military power and control of Cambodia throughout the 1980s. But they always sort of leave out that like, well, the reason Vietnam was still there was because the Khmer Rouge were running that insurgency. So there is this also like this process where it's like they valorize the Khmer, or sorry, not valorize, but like they, there was this toleration of the Khmer Rouge, and like instead of talking about their crimes or even talking about the Vietnamese tribunal of Khmer for Khmer Rouge crimes, like not even wanting to engage with the Vietnamese presence at all, we immediately thought like, well, how can we use Pol Pot against them because they must be so de facto like. They are Hitler, not us, not Pol Pot. It's the Vietnamese.
And the Vietnamese had their citizens massacred by the thousands right on their border. This wasn't us going to Iraq and starting a 10-year occupation for no reason, or even the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which we covered last year, which again was right on their border. The Khmer Rouge were hoping to start a war with Vietnam, and they did. And Vietnam simply said, "All right, we're nipping this in the bud. We know all the fucked up stuff these people have done, and it's not coming to us." And that is why they took the action that they did. They probably weren't so interested in an invasion, given they had to reconstruct their country, which wasn't an easy thing to do. We cover that as kind of like a side story in the show because the U.S. promised Vietnam war reparations under Nixon, and once he was ousted, we said Nixon who, and denied them their reparations.
I mean, it
So
looks like this
Vietnam had a
video.
lot of. Mhm.
Oh no, I was just saying because Hassan was like scrolling this video, and it looks like this video is just kind of about like how much life sucked under the Khmer Rouge.
Yeah,
Like, there's a
fair enough.
section on children and child labor. Then there's one on executions and one on prison. I mean, it makes sense. Like, it's interesting in that like the Khmer Rouge did have an interrogation and executions policy. Like, I don't know to what extent this video gets super deep into that, but like all of their torture centers, like it was the whole program was called S21, and the idea about it. Oh yeah, this is like the expression. And by the way, this guy Richard Dudman, he was a reporter at the St. Louis Dispatch for many years in the 20th century. He was an American reporter who had witnessed firsthand. He had been one of the very few reporters who
Lock in, let's go.
Chance to make a game of it here. One shot. Absolute perfection.
Senin görevin tüm oyunlarda en iyisi olmak, bizim görevimiz sana en iyi ekipmanları sağlamak. Sen de en iyi oyun deneyimi için MediaMarkt'a gel, Intel Core işlemcili ROG oyuncu bilgisayarlarıyla yapabileceklerini keşfet.
Yine diş etlerin kanadı değil mi? Selin, ses tellerin gayet iyi. Ama diş etlerin için aynı şeyi söyleyemeyeceğim. Sana Parodontax lazım. Düzenli kullanırsan Parodontax'la 1. haftadan itibaren diş eti onarımı başlar. Hadi göreyim seni.
In the early 1970s was in Cambodia and was with Vietnamese troops, Viet Cong soldiers, as they hid from American bombs being dropped on Cambodia. So, like, to give you a sense of how powerful the anti-Vietnam dogma was, a guy who saw the Americans bomb Cambodia firsthand and whose life was in danger because of it is the guy who wrote this Pol Pot article, because that's how strong, that's how much we can make them into bad guys.
You know, this is another thread of this season is the Sino-Soviet split, which is really representative of the greater split among, you know, the left all across the world, including the most annoying contingent of the left, the Western left. And the Western left had a bunch of crack-ups about, you know, like, are you a Maoist? Are you a third worldist? Are you supporting Pol Pot and the Maoist movements, the real movements? Or are you a fucking revisionist social fascist who supports the USSR? And, you know, the USSR wrote off a lot of the Chinese allies and the Chinese themselves as wackos. It's a very interesting conflict. But yeah, Dudman, I don't know if he was like ideologically on that level, but sort of as a reporter, yeah, he, as I said earlier, he was one of these guys who allowed his sympathy in the 60s for the Khmer Rouge fighters to turn him against the other fighters against the American war, the Vietnamese. And so it was like this strange, like, sort of siphoning off of support until people would arrive at only the Khmer Rouge, people of a certain opinion, which is a strange place to end up. But you can kind of see how it happens. I don't know. Strange times.
Damn. So would you say that this period of American foreign policy is like uniquely schizophrenic, or like is it the Mad Man
in a lot
theory,
of ways it makes a lot of sense. Like, that's part of what's so jarring and horrible about it, is that like essentially part of what the Cambodia, there's a book that we cite a lot in our show for this season called Sideshow, by the journalist William Shawcross, and although he later on like moved,
who
to
also
the right,
had an ideological journey.
Yeah, he's you can look him up. He's a British journalist. He's right wing now. But this original book, Sideshow, like, it was called Sideshow because the idea was that the Cambodia was a sideshow to the Vietnam War. But I think what our season has sort of recovered is not so much that, like, yes, the Vietnam conflict, yes, we bombed Cambodia, and that was because we tried to widen the Vietnam War in an effort to end it. We were like, all right, well, Nixon said, you know, I'd rather not just withdraw from Vietnam. I'd like to withdraw from Vietnam, but I want to increase the pressure, and I want to bomb where I think the Vietnamese are in Cambodia. And eventually that's, you know, like that was pushing the sets of dominoes that lead to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, sparking the civil war in that country and all that. But the other thing that Cambodia is not just the sideshow to the Vietnam War, but it was this part of this, you know, larger drama by which the U.S. was like rearranging what its Cold War strategy was for what became the final phase of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. The Khmer Rouge and the support for the Khmer Rouge was an early joint venture with China. You could look at it that way. Yep. You could see the sort of, you know, the cynicism in our policy as having actually like a really kind of dramatic coherence to it. I think what's schizophrenic is just how what feels schizophrenic and so immoral is that there was no reason that Henry Kissinger had to bomb Cambodia and also make detente with the Soviet Union. Why couldn't we just have detente? What was the fucking purpose of setting this country on fire, ultimately to arrive at the same thing in 1975 that would have fucking happened anyway years earlier with the end of Saigon, the fall of Saigon.
To ventriloquize the Kissinger Nixon logic a little bit, I think they viewed the world in the grand chessboard, spheres of influence, 19th century Bismarckian way, and that's certainly how Kissinger wrote and thought, and that's how Nixon, maybe not at the beginning of his career, but by the time he was the president, that's how he thought. He was considered himself a foreign policy president and one in the mold of creating a stable world order in which America is first among equals. When you take that view, prestige matters a lot. And so I think that, not to actually disagree with Noah about the human cost of any of this, but to their minds, if they were going to embark on as risky and bold a venture as making peace with China and normalizing relations with China to basically drive a wedge in the communist world, or take advantage of a wedge that was already forming in the communist world, they couldn't also lose the Vietnam War and also the war in Cambodia. They had to be strong enough by winning or perpetuating that war and punishing our victims there, to be strong enough and have this credibility of strength to make this other bold move, and vice versa. So it became a feedback loop of this kind of horrible logic where big countries we can work with, like China or the Soviet Union, because they got the SALT treaty out of it with the Soviet Union, which was good. But it's always at the expense of the smaller nations. This was something that Fidel kind of said around the time of the missile crisis, which you can agree with and disagree with as well in certain ways, which was like, although overall I find it persuasive, which is the United States and the USSR, we know they're going to work stuff out. The question is, what happens to us, the small countries? And I think that was the same question hanging over Nixon and Kissinger's peace deals with China for Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. It was a trade-off to them. You couldn't have one without the other. I think that's
in
what makes
Kissinger's
it.
case, the irony, not irony, the horrible thing is that in a way he was kind of the dude who's born for this mission, because his actual academic research and what he spent, or not research, it's a strong word for it, but what he spent time writing about and sort of espousing opinions about in Foreign Affairs magazine and stuff, was about this idea of fighting little wars in what he called the gray areas of the world. Um, yeah, I think he was a strategy master of this exact thing, and he was ready made for what Nixon needed, which was in essence to set the third world on fire. Because by the way, it wasn't just Cambodia. I mean, there's a very good book by the historian Paul Thomas Chamberlain called "The Cold War Killing Fields" that sort of tells the story of how the Cold War was this insanely hot war in all these little countries. I mean, or you had
And even some not so little ones like Indonesia.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Indonesia or fucking Bangladesh and Pakistan. I mean, those are not small countries either. I mean, it's rather, I mean, it's rather, there's some rather savage wars of peace. You could argue.
Yeah, and it's not to defend or revise the idea in America, and certainly in the countries where this happened, that Kissinger and Nixon were involved in evil ventures or brutal, senseless violence. But the I think it's worth clinically and carefully looking at why their policy was what it was, and what stabilizing things did come out of it, and what destabilizing things and terrible things came out of it. It was good to make peace with communist China. That was a needlessly hostile and destructive American policy for decades. It wasn't a good thing to obviously base that kind of progress on the expense of hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people in Indochina. Anthony Blinken possesses all of the craven aspects, for example, of what Kissinger would allow or enforce for his president on the global stage, with obviously zero of the vision or pretenses to vision that you can at least recognize um, in a self-aggrandizing, but ultimately significant historical uh, statesman like Kissinger. Um, Blinken is just a hopeless fool, and the American foreign policy now doesn't have anything like the kind of um, gutsy vision that these imperial minds had in the middle of the Cold War. So that's a way of talking about schizophrenia, the different angles. Like the last thing I'll say about it to sum it up is in China, when Kissinger died, he is officially a celebrated figure.
Yeah.
Americans, there's memes and he was evil. He's the most evil guy, which I sometimes think is kind of lets every other American war criminal off the hook. If it's just like, oh, there's just one guy who
Yeah.
was just the one evil person. It's not to again to defend or be an apologist. I think it's a little bit of baby's first,
Well, he is the reason that the Kissinger hate is so passionate is because of a very specific thing, which is that he lied about the Vietnam War ending. And like the sense of antipathy that I think like generations of Americans have held for him for years in particular really just comes down to like that more than anything, that he was like Nixon's Vietnam butt boy, and like that the justifiable and totally correct hatred of him at front.
He got a Nobel Peace Prize.
Exactly. Like it makes a lot, it's he was sort of,
So did Obama.
I mean, I was gonna say he reminds me honestly of like Elon Musk. Like, just imagine having to see his fucking mug everywhere for the 70s. Like, my God, that would be annoying.
Yeah.
Although it must be said, Kissinger was he had far more game than Elon Musk. He had far more riz than Elon
Yeah.
Musk.
Yeah.
Which is
He
not
did
a
a
high
lot.
bar.
He did a lot with how ugly he was. So I want to ask you guys one final question, but like, in terms of like, I guess on its face, somewhat incomprehensible foreign policy movements that the Nixon Kissinger duo engaged in, do you see an analog there with the current administration and the way that they're dealing with the dynamics between Hezbollah, Iran, the Gulf states, and also Israel? Or is it more so just like you said on autopilot at this point, and it's just like Anthony Blinken is a wormish figure who is just trying to let everybody dominate him. He's just sitting in the cuck seat along for the journey.
I agree with that. The one thing I would add is say that like, maybe the way to look at it is not like, oh, is this situation like that one or something, but it's like, what are the dynamics that were present in that situation and that may be present in this one and vice versa? Like in this case, like in Lebanon and Cambodia are not like an exact parallel. They're not like, and you can't force them. But there is a truth to the fact that like Cambodia and Lebanon were both sort of drawn into this, they're sort of in a conflict with Israel that is connected to a conflict that is connected to this other frontier of the conflict. And now Israel, as the war making party in the way that the US was, now has to like spread the war around because it cannot resolve the domestic political issues that would come with actually just ending the war, which in Nixon's case was the paranoia about not losing the war, really, his obsession with that, in addition to the anti-communist fervor or whatever. And in the case of Israel, it's about like, I mean, it's all of the things that we talked about earlier, the ideology, the sense, the actual stakes of survival or financial crisis and so on. But to me, that's sort of the point of comparison, is about like the degree to which like, a war can spread and suck other things in for no good intelligible reason at all other than to satisfy the political prerogatives of the war making party.
Yeah, we've talked about how there was a vision on behalf that the Nixon and Kissinger were pursuing. China, détente with the USSR, that was far more, honestly, compared to the policy that came before, far more coherent and possibly constructive even. That was taken in tandem with incredibly senseless wars that they viewed as bargaining chips, the countries involved as bargaining chips. I think what you have is no vision in the American side nowadays that could compare to their idea of a new world order that they were building. Israel's an alliance with Israel being one part of that, and it's Israel who is taking just the senseless violence half of the Nixon-Kissinger strategy, which, as Noah just said, you compare Nixon's remark when he announced the invasion of Cambodia, he said, to your point, Hasan, at the top of our part of the show, he said, "This is not an invasion. This is a way to end the war in Vietnam. In other words, escalating things into Cambodia is a way to de-escalate them in Vietnam." Well, what did Israel say the other day? We are escalating things as a way to achieve de-escalation. It's hard not to see an echo of what we discussed this season and the kind of ripple effects that that can have on a formerly nearby but neutral third country. And it remains to be seen. I hate when people say this, but we have to see, how Hezbollah, which has been attacked and has the right to self-defense, how conservative they are and how much of a balancing act they are willing to put up, because Cambodia put up a balancing act for many years to spare itself the violence, and eventually it failed. So we'll have to see how that goes in this case. But no one in our current day is, unfortunately, can be said to be as on the level of Nixon and Kissinger, I think, as far as their grand master plans are concerned.
Yeah, I mean, we're now in a position where Nixon and Kissinger, part of what made them so special, let's say, or unique, was that Kissinger literally had permission when as soon as he became a national security advisor to redo the wiring in Washington and become the most powerful advisor, like the hand of the prince or the hand of the king or whatever.
Literally the wiring.
He could do whatever, he had the authority to do all that. And one of the things with Biden world that's sort of become evident is that there's this troika at the top. You have Jake Sullivan, Anthony Blinken, and Bill Burns, who's the head of the CIA. And Bill Burns is the one who clearly is trusted with the big boy stuff or whatever, but there isn't actually any, I don't really believe at this stage that we have any evidence that there is a driver's seat, let alone somebody in it, in terms of the American strategic outlook here. So to affirm what Brennan was